Well, hello there. Welcome to Noob DM. And as you can see, Noob DM Ariel is not here. I have taken his place. They tell me that this is the month for all things ghoulish and all things haunted and all things scary and spooky. And what is more spooky than character death in Dungeons and Dragons or RPGs in general? Um, well, if you're playing fifth edition, it may not be that scary because you may never see it. So welcome. This is the third part in the series about death in the RPG or role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons, and we will discuss some mechanics today. Um, uh, Death just isn't what it used to be. And I'm sure if you played OSR games or any earlier version of D&D or tabletop games for that matter that are fantasy based, you will concur with me, the count. You will concur that death is not what it used to be. So let's get into some mechanics, shall we? Okay, guys. So, not to harp on this too much, but here we have, as you can see, if you play 5th edition, you're very familiar with the 5th edition character sheet, and we're talking about character death, and you can see right in the if I can focus for a second, if you take a look at this fifth, and if you're familiar with fifth edition, you can see this character sheets that you have death saves recorded, and you basically roll a d20. I think it's a d20 like everything else, and you have basically three death saves, which is crazy to me. Three death saves that you can make before you are actually your character is completely dead. Of course, if you take a ton of damage all at once, or if you have like a critical failure, I think that they count. You get killed right away because of context. So context is important, but nevertheless, it's a lot. The point I'm trying to make is that in the new edition, it's a lot harder to die than it was in previous editions of the game. Now, I haven't looked at my first edition books in a while, and I really never looked up the death mechanic that much because it didn't. It did come up back in the day when I was playing first edition, but it's been a long time. So I am going to, if you bear with me, let's take a look at what the and I have looked at death as it pertains to character death, and as it pertains to the mechanics of first edition, and there's a lot of it is spelled out in the Dungeon Master's Guide, as opposed to like the player's handbook. So if you go to the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, let's look at hit points, which is on page 82. So let's turn to page 82 of the manual. Give me a second. 82. Here we go. What does it say about hit points? It says hit points, 0 hit points. Here we go. When any creature is brought to 0 hit points, optionally as low as -3 hit points, if from the same blow which brought the total to 0, it is unconscious. So they still go unconscious at 0 hit points. In each of the next succeeding rounds, one additional negative point will be lost until -10 is reached and the creature dies. So they had up to -10. So you're saying, okay, well, that's kind of hard to reach. Not really. I mean, it's like you don't get 3 saving throws or 3 death throws. Such loss and death are caused from bleeding, shock, convulsions, non-respiration, and similar causes. It ceases immediately on any round. On any round, a friendly creature administers aid to an unconscious one. Any character brought to 0 or fewer hit points and then revived will remain in a coma for 1 to 6 turns. So they're comatized for 1 to 6 turns. So it's not like they can just get up and be okay. If any creature reaches a state of -6 or greater negative points before being revived, this could indicate scarring or the loss of some member if you choose. For example, a character struck by a fireball and then treated at -9 might have horrible scar tissue on exposed areas of flesh, harm, hands, arms, neck, and face. And this is consistent with like Dungeon Crawl Classics and some of the OSR games. And then he talks about intoxication table. It goes on to what happens with alcohol. But the point is that you know, death was handled way differently in the old edition than in the new. Now I'm just curious if I'll turn to the player's handbook next and see if there's any reference, point of reference on that character death, because I don't think they really spell it out much. If you bear with me again, looking at the at this index, the second part of the book where he talks about combat procedures. There we go, combat. There's also saving throws. So let's turn to page 105 of the first edition player's handbook and see how, if there's any reference, because there's a whole section here on the adventure, and it talks about combat, it talks about spellcasting, it talks about healing and a bunch of other things. Okay, so combat procedure, the saving throw. The way it worked in first edition is the chance to avoid or partially negate magical and breath attack forms is known as the save. So basically, you had saving throws for against dragon's breath and spells and different things like that. The armor class was a little bit different because, as we know, if you play the old school game, we had the negative armor class, so it wasn't like it is now, because now the numbers are ascending. So if you have the higher your armor class, the harder to hit. So if you have a 17, 18, 19, 20 and up, that's the best armor class that you can get, or some of the best armor classes that are really hard to hit. But conversely, in the OSR or the original or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you had negative. So you have a 0 as the base, and then you could go into the negatives if you have like a magical armor. So you could -1, -2, -3 armor, which be really difficult to achieve.
Well, that was a little weird. Did you guys just see a vampire? Um, let's just go on with our discussion of the death mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons. And I will say that um, my camera battery was about to die, and I had made some points about the first edition. One saying the only point that I left out was basically saying that it goes on to talk about poison and some states, primarily what happens to characters when they're poisoned. But it's kind of peculiar or interesting that they don't really go into death mechanics too much on the player's handbook. As detailed, I think it's more detailed on the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I guess that makes sense. I went ahead and did this presentation for second edition just to summarize it because I wasn't having, the camera was kind of dying. So basically, death mechanics in second edition, in terms of damage, as you see here, the hit point loss was cumulative until a character died or had a chance to heal wounds. And this can be found on page 103 of the AD&D Player's Handbook for second edition. So what happens when they reach 0 hit points is when a character reaches 0 hit point, the character is dead. He's slain. The character is immediately dead and unable to do anything unless some specialized magical effect takes place. And there is inescapable death when you take a ton of damage and um, other factors that are outlined in the player's handbook. If you have a copy or want to take a look. In terms of inescapable death, it does say that there are occasions when a player character or a PC's death is unavoidable, no matter how many hit points a character has. And this is detailed on the second edition uh, Player's Handbook, page 106. And what's interesting to me is they could raise the dead, like with a cleric spell or with some type of magic, just like in 5e. But in the AD&D second edition rules, each time a player character is returned from the death, the player character has to make a resurrection survival roll based on his or her constitution. So the Constitution stat, which is usually like a dump stat for a lot of people, unless you're a fighter or you need to have, a lot of, like for a magic user, it might not be that important. But for a melee character, then it's definitely important. But in second edition, it was important for everybody because if you died, you're kind of like a cat, which I thought was interesting. It's like you have X number of lives. If your constitution is low, below average, 9 lives, nine, a score of 9 constitution. And once those 9 lives are gone, then you cannot be restored. The character is dead because a character restored to life has his or her constitution lowered by 1 point every time they died, which was really interesting mechanic. And so, in closing, my conclusion is do not be afraid to kill more characters. Follow Matt Mercer's recommendations. He's not afraid to kill characters on Critical Role, and neither should you. I think it makes for a much more compelling and dramatic combat. But what do you guys think? Um, I'll leave it up to you to decide, and I'll close this discussion of death on in D&D for now. So if you like this kind of content, go ahead and hit or like, go ahead and hit the subscribe button rather, and don't forget to like. And I'll catch up with you guys next time on D&D Saturday, where we'll talk some more about death mechanics in all the editions of Dungeons and Dragons.